So many people wanting to see Pope Francis, the Vatican keeping the doors open overnight until 5:30 in the morning. And even then, thousands were still waiting, the line stretching up to a mile at times.
Maria Elena Bergoglio lived in silence as her brother became Pope Francis. But when headlines distorted his past, she chose to speak. Her account brings us closer to the man behind the papacy, shaped by family, hardship, and faith. What did she reveal about their upbringing? How did she respond to his critics? And why did her voice matter at that moment? Let's examine the specifics. Maria Elena Bergoglio opted for that silence for years. Nestled in the suburbs of Ituzaingó, Argentina, she kept silent as the only surviving sibling of Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Today, the world knows him as Pope Francis. Maria Elena remained silent as her brother spoke to millions of people in different countries. She didn't want attention, she wasn't in the public eye, and she wasn't going to speak up. Silence, however, was no longer an option. Her narrative is not one of celebrity or pomp, but rather one of witnessing history as it played out in her own family. The Bergoglio family established a life based on faith, hard work, and perseverance in a modest Buenos Aires home decades before the papal white robes. Mario José Bergoglio, their father, was born in Italy and moved to Argentina in 1999. He came to South America in search of safety and opportunity after leaving behind a Europe weighed down by Benito Mussolini's fascist government. Mario, who worked as a railway accountant, moved to Buenos Aires with his wife, Regina Maria Sivari, who was from an Italian family with roots in Piedmont's northern area. Together, they raised 5 children: Alberto, Oscar, Marta, Jorge Mario, and Maria Elena, the youngest, in a house that reflected Catholic discipline and tradition. They lived in humility rather than grandeur at their Flores neighborhood home. Even though they didn't have much money, Maria Elena would later remember that they had structure, affection, and a strong moral compass. Homemaker Regina taught the value of compassion and humility. Consistent and moral, Mario stressed the importance of truth and hard work. Each child's character was molded by these values, especially Jorge, who had to take on the role of one of the oldest after his brother Alberto died when he was still a small boy. Maria Elena remembers him as her older brother who took care of her after their father passed away, rather than as a future pope. Jorge balanced his education and obligations with taking on additional jobs to help maintain the family and taking care of his mother. In an interview, she claimed that he was always calm and always put the needs of others above his own. He provided guidance, assisted with schooling, and was a pillar of support for a family dealing with loss. Maria Elena was significantly younger than Jorge, yet they had a close relationship. In many respects, he was like a second parent. Jorge became interested in sports and chemistry as a teenager, and he took both subjects seriously. He obtained a diploma as a chemical technician from Escuela Técnica Industrial. He briefly held a position in a food science lab. Maria Elena saw something different in her brother, something subtle but persistent, despite his academic and athletic endeavors. Everywhere he went, he had a tiny Bible with him. It seemed as though he had always had faith rather than having acquired it. When Jorge was 21 years old, that subtle draw toward the priesthood became apparent. His choice to join the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, a Catholic order renowned for its social justice and academic rigor, shocked the family. The choice was not taken hastily. Jesuits make a commitment to poverty, chastity, and obedience, values that would require a lot of him and, in turn, his family. Maria Elena recalls his telling them. The house was silent and unsure. Their proud yet obviously emotional mother was a devoted Catholic. Given that their father had already died away, Jorge's choice would further distance them from their family. From now on, the siblings would see him less, and eventually very little. It had a particularly profound effect on Maria Elena. He had always been there for her, and he was her confidant. However, she realized that he was being called to something greater rather than away from them. Jorge never broke the bonds that held them together, even if they were emotionally apart. He kept writing to Maria Elena and their mother throughout his time in seminary, and the early years of his priesthood. These notes were warm and loving, but they were not official. He asked them about their everyday lives, offered his thoughts, and let them know they were still a part of his path. Maria Elena recognized the same brother she had known all her life in those letters, but he was now pursuing something far more ambitious than any of them could comprehend. Jorge advanced in the Jesuit order throughout time. In December of 1969, he received his priestly ordination. He was only 36 when he was appointed provincial superior of the Jesuits in Argentina in 1973. After years of pastoral and administrative service, he was appointed auxiliary bishop of Buenos Aires in 1992. He had previously served as a seminary rector and a spiritual director. From there, he was named archbishop in 1898 and was made a cardinal by Pope John Paul II in 2101. Maria Elena watched from afar over these decades of growth in the clerical field. His public duties increased, yet the letters persisted. His schedule grew increasingly hectic, and he had fewer personal moments due to the demands of leadership. Nevertheless, she led a modest life and never sought the limelight that comes with being a public figure's cousin. She didn't see Jorge as a future church leader. He remained her brother. Maria Elena was at home in Argentina on March 13th, the day the world drastically changed. As the rest of the world waited to hear the new pope's name, she watched on television as white smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel. She cried when Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, came out onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. She was struck by the remembrance of everything he had sacrificed, everything their family had shared, and everything he had carried in silence to get there, not just by the enormity of the occasion. Her peaceful existence abruptly changed. Within hours, journalists were at her door. At first, she was too overwhelmed by the attention to say much. More than 1 billion Catholics now looked up to the man she called Jorge as their spiritual leader. She felt the distance widen, but she was also incredibly gratified. His position as cardinal had already made their communication scarce, and it became even more so. In addition to being her brother, he was now the Bishop of Rome, with duties that went much beyond their immediate family. But she stayed calm. She highlighted their upbringing in humility, discretion, and faith in a few interviews after the Pope election. She clarified that these were the reasons she hadn't previously spoken in public. She didn't want to draw undue attention or overshadow his purpose. Her brother's path was one of service rather than celebrity. Maria Elena saw her brother's management style garner media attention in the months that followed. He refused the papal residence, wore modest clothes, bathed inmates' feet, and spoke out against climate change and inequality. She was not surprised by these acts. She believed that even as a boy, Jorge had always lived this way. He consistently prioritized the needs of others before his own. In one interview, she claimed that his role as Pope was simply an extension of who he had always been. While Jorge's life was irrevocably altered by that day in St. Peter's Square, Maria Elena frequently thought about how her life had changed in unexpected ways. She was the focus of tremendous media interest in the days after his election as Pope. International media outlets demanded interviews, photographers knocked on her door, and reporters set up camp outside her tiny Ituzaingó home. She retained the serene dignity that characterized her personality in spite of the chaos. She spoke selectively because she believed her brother's narrative didn't need to be embellished, not because she was afraid. She was happy, but also wary. She claimed that understanding what that position required was inextricably linked to the pride she felt in witnessing her brother ascend to the popeship. She felt compelled to speak about Pope Francis in a way that respected his choice of simplicity and humility. In one interview, she stated, "To me, he is still Jorge, and I will always talk about him in that way." During his tenure as Pope, Jorge Mario Bergoglio gained notoriety for defying papal conventions. Instead of living in the Apostolic Palace, Francis opted to live in the Vatican guest house. He shunned ornate rituals, favored intimate interactions over showy displays, and dressed simply in white. Although these decisions garnered international notice, Maria Elena was accustomed to them. Long before he became a cardinal and adopted the name Francis, He had lived that way. Simplicity had always been his compass, from their early years to his priesthood. She observed how his public behavior reflected their parents' teachings. Mario, their father, frequently talked about the value of sticking to one's convictions and the dignity of work. Regina, their mother, frequently reminded the kids that kindness was more valuable than prestige, and placed a strong emphasis on humility and concern for others. Maria Elena thought that her brother's papacy was built on these principles. Pope Francis's acts, such as washing the inmates' feet or dining with workers rather than dignitaries, were a reflection of the very home they grew up in. However, heightened scrutiny, especially with reference to his history, accompanied the worldwide attention. The years between 1976 and 1983, when Argentina was under military dictatorship, were the subject of one of the biggest disputes involving Pope Francis's early years. The regime's violent campaign against political dissidents during this time resulted in the detention, torture, or disappearance of thousands of Argentinians. During this time, Jorge Mario Bergoglio held the position of provincial superior of the Jesuits in Argentina, which presented challenging moral dilemmas. His actions, or lack thereof, during those gloomy years were questioned. He was criticized for failing to sufficiently protect members of his religious community, especially two Jesuit priests, Orlando Yorio and Francisco Jolix, who were tortured and imprisoned in 197, and for failing to publicly criticize the regime. Following his election in 2013, the charges attracted fresh attention. For her part, Maria Elena ardently supported her brother. She addressed these worries by thinking back on her family's past and Jorge's personality, rather than by making theatrical defenses. Their family opposed all forms of tyranny. Their father had left Italy to avoid Nazism. In interviews, she clarified that Jorge's silence under the dictatorship was a calculated tactic rather than an act of complicity. She contended that speaking candidly might have put more lives in jeopardy. She insisted that he protected others by working covertly behind the scenes. Testimonies from survivors and later discovered documents corroborated her claims, demonstrating that Jorge had assisted a number of individuals in escaping persecution by giving them safe passage or fictitious documents. Even Francisco Jolix, one of the survivors, subsequently explained that he had made amends with Pope Francis and did not hold him accountable for the arrest, while the situation of the two Jesuit priests remained controversial. For Maria Elena, the charges were personal in nature rather than merely political. She had witnessed the price of her brother's moral and religious convictions. She recalled the evenings he worked overtime, the care he provided for his mother and siblings, and his attempts to provide for the family following the death of their father. She was acquainted with the man. It was unthinkable to her that he would ever associate himself with injustice or brutality. Personal gossip also spread, in addition to political disputes. They included the allegation that Jorge had fallen in love with a woman when he was younger and, after experiencing heartbreak, went to the priesthood. Maria Elena immediately brushed this suggestion off. She clarified that any tales linking his vocation to romantic disappointment were baseless, as his sense of calling had existed since adolescence. She added, "He didn't become a priest because he had a broken heart. He felt that it was God's will for him to become a priest." Despite her reluctance, Maria Elena's public persona expanded over these years. She conducted a few interviews, all of which were restrained and honest. She never made an effort to present her brother as perfect. Rather, she depicted a man who was molded by adversity, kept alive by faith, and led by love. Her defense of him was based on long-time observation rather than public relations. She also talked about the experience of losing a sibling's everyday presence due to a high-level position. She and Jorge had spoken frequently before the year 1313. Letters now served as their primary means of communication. He continued to write to her, occasionally by hand, but always with love and consideration. She treasured these letters. They reminded her that he stayed rooted in the family despite the responsibilities of the Pope. His remarks were replete with prayers and words of encouragement, and they always concluded with blessings for her and her kids. Their relationship persisted despite the fact that they now lived in totally different worlds. According to Maria Elena, Jorge belonged to her, while the Pope was the property of the Church. It was a statement of perspective rather than possession. She had known him before the microphones, before the international stage, before the vestments. He was still, in her heart, the brother who consoled her after their father passed away, helped with her schoolwork, and read to her when she was a child. She started to view her own role differently as his papacy went on. She was first opposed to being in the spotlight, but she eventually realized that it was essential to speak up, carefully and honestly, to honor the memories of the brother she knew, not to protect the Pope's reputation. She believed that although silence had benefited them for many years, it eventually let false information proliferate unchecked. She didn't use fanfare or drama when she did decide to speak candidly. It was with the silent determination of someone who had spent decades living her truth. Her interviews were straightforward, grounded in reality, and consistently returned to the same conclusion. Her brother was a man of conscience, molded by faith, dedicated to others, and misinterpreted by those who valued publicity over people. Maria Elena rarely discussed the emotional toll of her brother's job in public, despite her maintained calm defense of him. It went beyond historical disputes and media inquiries. It was the price one had to pay for having a sibling. Their connection unavoidably changed when Jorge was appointed Pope Francis. Their communications became less frequent. Time zones, distance, and the weighty obligations of heading the Catholic Church changed their formerly intimate rhythm. However, the connection remained constant. Even as the Bishop of Rome, Pope Francis took the time to write to his sister. In a time when public people rely on staff-written comments and emails, his letters were warm, intimate, and handwritten. Maria Elena preserved them as live components of their relationship rather than as keepsakes. In interviews, she explained that his statements always had the same tone: faith-filled, compassionate, and protective. It reminded her that her brother was still the same person, even when he was silent. Not only what Jorge did, but also what he decided not to do, was what Maria Elena found most striking. He seldom ever discussed the criticisms or his own personal sacrifices. He frequently opted for caution over retort when asked about his history. That was his nature, Maria Elena explained. He favored conscience above defense and action over argument. She interpreted this as power rather than passivity. She saw his stillness as a kind of presence rather than absence. She eventually realized that standing up for him in public had become a part of her own destiny, not because he requested it, and most definitely not for praise. However, she couldn't stand to watch his life portrayed because she knew the truth. She clarified that speaking up was about maintaining memory, fixing mistakes, and defending the principles they were taught, not about projecting a certain image. Many onlookers were taken aback by the disparity in their lives. One of the siblings went on to become one of the most powerful religious figures in the contemporary world. The other lived in a modest home and frequently went to her local parish or did daily chores like shopping at the market. That disparity, however, never resulted in separation. Maria Elena frequently claimed that their relationship did not necessitate continuous contact. It was there in their mutual respect, their common history, and their unshakable faith as a pillar. She also voiced concern about how prominence and power are frequently seen as the only ways to have meaning in the world. She didn't think she had to live in Jorge's shadow because of his success. Instead, she believed that their lives represented two different avenues for service, hers in a peaceful town, his on a worldwide scale. That reflected their upbringing in many ways. Although their mother never received much attention, everything that the family became was influenced by her leadership. In the same way, Maria Elena viewed her own role. Her viewpoint has provided unique insight into Pope Francis's leadership over the years. Maria Elena reminded people of his humanity when the media attempted to characterize him through institutional narratives or political glasses. She talked candidly and lovingly about their early years. She recalled his serious demeanor, his sensitivity and humor, and his times of discipline. Her tales depicted a man who was firmly anchored in principles rather than output. She mentioned in multiple interviews that Jorge used to read to her when she was a child. She recalled how he helped her with her homework and used Bible stories to teach her moral values. These were snippets of everyday life that influenced them both, not contrived memories. She said that nothing had changed in her heart when asked how she currently felt about him. Even though he now bore the responsibilities of an entire church, he was still her older brother and the person who helped her grow up. She was aware of the pressure that came with that duty. Maria Elena recognized that his position was an emotional difficulty as much as a luxury. She was concerned about what was expected of him, how his words were questioned, and how every movement he made was examined. She had witnessed the mental and even bodily toll it took. For this reason, she made an effort to maintain his humanity, rather than the papal image, front and center throughout her limited public appearances. She also talked about how the world frequently undervalues the influence of families on prominent personalities. Maria Elena thought that Jorge's perspective had been permanently shaped by their upbringing, particularly by their mother's influence. They have always welcomed guests into their home. She remembered how Regina always greeted neighbors and distant relatives who would stop by, sometimes in need. She believed that Pope Francis's later concern on immigrants, the underprivileged, and the marginalized was largely influenced by this early experience of hospitality and compassion. Maria Elena realized that her remarks had weight due to her brother's transformation, even though she never sought public influence. She became even more cautious as a result. She never exaggerated or sought attention by choosing her words carefully in any interview. She identified herself not as a spokesperson, but as a witness. However, her speech provided background information that few others could. Her recollections anchored Pope Francis's persona in a lived past that was fashioned in the humble quarters of a family home rather than in cathedrals or conferences. Her cool, collected demeanor contrasted with the frequently dramatic media coverage of the Vatican. She struggled when the media selectively highlighted her brother's remarks or misrepresented his intentions. Truth was more essential to her than haste. She previously said that she preferred to think in a world that is quick to pass judgment. She claimed that this belief was a result of both her faith and her upbringing. It was never stated by Maria Elena that she spoke for Pope Francis. She spoke solely based on her knowledge, observations, and recollections. Her voice was unique because of its clarity. It held something more personal, credibility based on lifelong observation, but it lacked institutional power. And it was plenty, in her opinion. There was nothing for her to prove. All she had to do was say what was true. Maria Elena was aware that her choice to speak up was not only about dispelling myths, but also about making sure that her brother's story, and by implication her family's, would be told honestly. She didn't look for praise or recognition. She desired for people to view Jorge as a man who came from a lowly background and was molded by love, selflessness, and unwavering faith, rather than just as a pope. She was especially aware of how quickly the intimate may be erased by global discourses. For her, he was still the same brother who used to carry her school bag and remind her to say her prayers before bed. But titles like His Holiness or the Supreme Pontiff instilled a sense of separation. In her conversations, she frequently went back to the fundamentals, not religious ideas or political analysis, but the qualities she had witnessed throughout her life: compassion, self-control, honesty, and a strong sense of duty to others. Mutual understanding rather than frequent communication was what kept their relationship strong despite the oceans and duties that separated them. They could stay in touch without making daily calls. An occasional letter, a silent prayer, and recollections that lasted for decades were sufficient. Maria Elena clarified that Jorge's method of showing concern was constancy and silent presence, rather than ornate gestures. Nothing had changed about that. She frequently sensed his presence, even while they were apart. She knew the movements, the tone of voice, and even the expressions that had been a part of him since he was a young boy when he was on television giving homilies or visiting the ill. She could tell when he was happy, when he was worried, and when he was exhausted. She said that their brother's relationship was the source of such intuition, rather than his position. Maria Elena gradually grew more comfortable with the attention from the public. She realized that people were interested in the Pope, but they were also trying to find out what made him human. She believed that when their experience was told honestly and without drama, it gave others something of value. It served as a reminder to everyone that ordinary families, daily decisions, and the subdued power of home shape even the most powerful people. Her statement that Jorge no longer belonged solely to their family was among her most impactful public statements. He now belonged to the people and the church. However, she went on to say that it was still critical to preserve his dignity as a person, not as an organization. Speaking up became an act of service for her. Offering background and reintegrating the public figure into the human narrative from which he originated was more important than trying to change people's opinions. Maria Elena never asserted her power or superiority. Since she was the only person remaining with the ability to speak, she did so. She continued to be the Bergoglio family's living memory, following the passing of their parents and siblings. That history was in her voice. It held the strength of a silent testimony, love, and honesty. The video for today has now come to an end. Make sure to see the other videos on the channel if you followed us this far.